Good morning, everyone. I will call to order the July 26, 2023 Clackamas County Board of Commissioners Land Use Meeting. Please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Good morning, everyone. We are holding this meeting in person and virtually. If you've joined us via Zoom for this meeting and are interested in providing public comment, we will prompt you regarding how to do that when the time is right. The Zoom link and instructions to participate via Zoom are located at clackamas.us/meetings/BCC/land use. Today we will consider ZDO 287, a proposed legislative text amendment to the Clackamas County Zoning and Development Ordinance that is intended to make changes to the ZDO to resolve potential conflicts with federal law to allow for the development and operation of churches and other religious institutions and facilities in most zoning designations within unincorporated areas of Clackamas County. General public comment will be taken at the usual allotted time. As always, the public is welcome to sign up to testify. For those attending in person, please fill out a blue card and give it to Tony over here, and you will be called on to provide your testimony at the appropriate time. When you are called on, be sure to include your name and the area where you live. I would like to remind all participants, including staff, all elected officials, and members of the public, that Robert's Rules of Order will be enforced in this meeting. In this hearing, We will welcome your opinions and look forward to your polite participation. The hearing on ZDO-287 will proceed as follows. First, we will hear a presentation from Principal Planner Martha Fritzie, sitting at the side desk. Next, Planning Commission Chair Gerald Murphy will present the Planning Commission's recommendation. I understand he's zooming in today. Next, I will open the public hearing for testimony, beginning with public officials who will have 5 minutes each. Then representatives from recognized planning community organizations and agencies will have 3 minutes each. Finally, others wishing to testify will have 3 minutes each. The board will then deliberate and either render a decision today or set a time to make a decision at a later date. Assisting us today with the hearing are our clerks, Tony Maynorick and Everett Wild, and planner Martha Fritzie over here, and Assistant County Counsel Jeffrey Mums. Does any commissioner have any questions before we proceed? I will now have Martha Fritzie open it up.
Good morning. I'm Martha Fritzie with the County's Planning and Zoning Division, and we have a hopefully brief PowerPoint presentation to go through the proposal in just a moment. All right, excellent. So, as was mentioned, we are here for consideration of a package of legislative text amendments to the County Zoning and Development Ordinance. This is all listed under file number ZDO 287. These text amendments are being proposed to ensure that our ZDO is compliant with a federal law called the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act, or RLUIPA for short, I will call it. And specifically that places of worship are treated equally with other similarly situated non-religious uses. And so why are we here? Well, the county is a party to a lawsuit related to an allegation of potential unequal treatment of our ZDO. And so county council and staff reviewed a long list of uses in the county's ZDO that may be considered similar to places of worship. In addition to the ones that we traditionally have, we didn't think and don't think we have a problem necessarily with our zoning and development ordinance. But because of some new information that's come out, we looked at this longer list of uses that may be potentially similar and have identified possible conflicts in nearly all of our zoning districts, and decided to be proactive and make some changes just to ensure that we don't have a problem or any liability in the future. And so back in May, county staff came and talked to the Board of County Commissioners about this issue and posed a question to you to get some direction about whether or not you would like to change the zoning code to make places of worship more permissive, to tie to the most permissive, potentially similarly situated uses, or if you wanted to go the other direction and possibly restrict other uses to be the same as the way places of worship are currently treated in our zoning ordinance. And we were given the direction to go the route of making places of worship more permissive. And so that's what we've done. And it involves amending the allowance for places of worship in most of our zoning districts. Most of the changes are from an allowance for a place of worship under a conditional use permit to a primary use. And if you recall, we had a conversation about this too, a conditional use permit. Or conditional use means that the use may be allowed, but it needs to go through an assessment of impacts. There's generally a public hearing involved before the use is allowed to operate, whereas a primary use is just determined as allowed and does not require additional approvals for the use itself. In both cases, the actual development would go through a development review process, either design review or another similar type review, just to make sure the physical development meets all of our development standards. And so the differentiation is just in how the use is allowed, whether or not it's just allowed or it needs to go through this additional hearings process. The proposal would also allow places of worship in the open space management district as a conditional use. Currently, places of worship are not listed as allowed, and there are some other potentially similar uses that are conditional uses, and so we've made that change. The important thing to keep in mind is when we say open space management district, we are not talking about natural resource areas. We're talking about a designation that is called public and community use open space, and it's only in the urban area, and often is associated with schools and playgrounds and things like that. And so that's where it would potentially be allowed. So specifically, we would be making a change in all of our residential zones. From a conditional use to primary use to be similar in allowance for the most permissive use that may be similarly situated, which in this case are certain government-owned recreational uses that include things like community buildings and amphitheaters. The same change is made in the commercial zones, although currently several of our commercial zones do allow places of worship as a primary use. Obviously, those wouldn't change. The remainder of them that have it listed as a conditional use now would be changed to a primary use, again, to be allowed in the same manner as these certain recreation uses. I noted the open space zone. Currently, places of worship are not listed. They are proposed to be added as a conditional use, again, similar to certain recreation uses, meeting facilities, and libraries. There are a few other changes included in the proposal related to development standards. There is one specific section, Section 804 in our zoning code, that has specific standards for places of worship, and we just wanted to make sure that it was clear that places of worship could either use those special sometimes you get additional height or additional or reduced setback, that a place of worship could use those standards or whatever is included in the underlying zoning district. And so the intent is to make sure that it's treated exactly the same as other uses in the zoning district. And then we are proposing to amend our parking standards for places of worship to be more closely aligned to other uses that may be similar. I believe our parking table lists things like theaters, dance halls, roller skating rinks that actually had a different parking ratio than places of worship, arguably. And so we're just aligning those. And so those are all of the changes that are in your package right now. In the package of information you received last week is a detailed analysis and findings related to all of the applicable approval criteria that we have to look at when we make these types of changes to the text of our zoning code, including the statewide planning goals, Metro's urban growth management functional plan, the county's own comprehensive plan, and the county's zoning and development ordinance. I am not going to go through each of those in detail. They're in the Planning Commission staff report that was included as the third item in your packet. But I'm certainly happy to answer questions if there's any questions about those. Where'd it go? So we did have a Planning Commission hearing, a public hearing before the Planning Commission for consideration of this package. It was a month ago on June 26th. At that hearing, there was no oral testimony provided. In your packet, there is one piece of written testimony that we have received from the from DLCD, Department of Land Conservation and Development. That's the only testimony we've received on this matter. At the Planning Commission hearing, there really was one significant issue, or one issue that rose to significance, and it had to do with whether or not to allow places of worship in industrial zones. And you'll notice I haven't mentioned them as being in your package right now. The original proposal that we took to the Planning Commission did include some changes in the county's industrial zones. And there has the testimony from DLCD, some comments from the board at their policy session in May, and conversation among the Planning Commission discussion identified a number of concerns with potentially allowing places of worship in industrial zones. And so ultimately, the Planning Commission voted to recommend approval of ZDO 287, but without any changes to the industrial zones. And so that's what we have brought forward to you today. A lot of the concerns identified had to do with preservation of industrial lands for jobs-producing uses, understandably. There was some talk about potential conflicts or compatibility with the place of worship and other industrial users. And so staff has not included that in your proposal today because there are some other options potentially that we could look at to the extent that you agree that there are actual conflicts in the industrial zones. The original proposal was to allow places of worship as a primary use, but we could allow them as a conditional use, similar to other assembly-type uses in industrial zones. It doesn't have to be allowed as a primary use. The issue is that to do so, we would have to be more restrictive on some other uses in industrial zones. And if we think if that's the way we're going, it would warrant additional conversation. And it most certainly would need to be done under a different process with additional notice if we are going to change other uses, because that was not part of the original proposal. So as I mentioned, the industrial zone piece is not included in the proposal in front of you today under ZDO 287. Staff's recommendation, it reflects the Planning Commission's recommendation at this point, and that would be to approve ZDO 287 as it is proposed to you today, which includes the changes to the residential, commercial, open space, those other development standards, but not changes to the industrial zones. And that's it for me. Do you have any questions?
Commissioners, questions? Commissioner Scholl.
Yes, Ms. Fritzy, thank you for that briefing. The letter from the DLCD expressed concern about the potential loss of industrial land if we allowed places of worship as a primary use. Do we have an idea of the impact, the potential impact on our industrial lands if we pass the amendments as proposed? In other words, tomorrow, is there going to be a dozen churches wanting to build a several acre, 4 or 5 acre development on our industrial land? Or is this a small issue that shouldn't raise much concern?
There's really no way to tell how we don't have people knocking at our door and asking questions about from places of worship about locating in industrial zones. I just want to be clear that the proposal right now does not include changes to industrial zones. We could add that back in if you choose to. But there's no way to know, honestly. And what I can say is that places of worship have been allowed in a lot of our commercial zones for a long time. And I don't believe very many have located there in reality. There's a few.
Okay, so let me just ask one more question to make sure I'm clear on this. The proposed amendment would allow for places of worship as a primary use in all industrial zones. Yes or no? No.
No.
Okay. And, all right. So then, if that's the case, will this satisfy the federal lawsuit?
These amendments will directly address the zoning that's involved in that lawsuit, which is residential. There's rural residential farm 5, right? RRFF 5. Okay, so that's one of the residential zones that we modified. It's ZDO 316 would be amended as part of these changes. So yeah, so it would change those requirements for a conditional use permit that are at issue in the lawsuit.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Savas, do you have any comments?
My question is answered.
Thank you. Commissioners, if you want to address our industrial zones at some time, or if there's a reason for us to do it from the planning department, I am not closed to that idea. If there are conflicts, maybe at some other date when it's on schedule to do so, but I think we're fine with this today. Everett, is the Planning Commission Chair Murphy on Zoom?
Yes, he is. Chair Murphy, go ahead.
Do you need to open the hearing?
Oh,
Thank
yes.
you.
I will open one. No.
Thank you. Good morning, Chair Smith, Commissioners. This was a very interesting subject we had. It went a little deeper than I thought it would. The first question right off the bat is, how does the county define a place of worship? It's a very broad question. Must be careful how to answer. Freedom of religion is a constitutional right. No matter what form a place of worship takes, certain questions must be asked for zoning purposes. A regular meeting of a congregation at a place of worship would still have to meet county zoning requirements like setbacks, parking requirements, landscaping, screening from neighbors, noise code. Is it up to the county to require proof that the place of worship is for a legitimate religious congregation? How do you find that out? Do you go through Oregon tax law? One of the commissioners brought forward another idea, so to speak, and then it switched to industrial lands. Planning Commission is focused on industrial land as being land dedicated for employment purposes. Point made that the state recognizes chaplains, like for prison and youth services, they represent an organization that the state recognizes. A state policy would define how to recognize that chaplain to work in a prison system or in a youth authority or something like that. County could use state policy to define what is a recognized religious organization for ZDO purposes. I did my own research while looking at this and just kind of thumbed around through the country, what other people are being sued or what other cities are being sued over this, or states or counties. And there was quite a bit of activity in this. And it looks like mega churches are looking for industrial lands. They're looking for industrial lands because there are a lot of abandoned buildings in these areas that are massive in size, have services to them, and this could be a great place to move a church to grow their congregation. They have services in place already, and they can handle that load. We talked about that just a little bit. But then it switched to that there is a shortage of large industrial areas, and the county should not contribute to that shortage. We need to rewrite the zoning to protect industrial zones from other uses for future growth and employment. Would opening up industrial zones for other uses begin to interfere with industry or limit industry once it has other uses taking place around it? Because of noise, because of traffic, something like that? Would that interfere with these other activities that are going on? Do other uses that might support industry open the door to religious practices? Another tough question. Conditional use? Define our conditional use. Martha just did. Discretionary decisions by a hearing officer. They must be consistent. And that would be for a place of worship versus a supportive service of industry in an industrial use area. Other uses that might support industry might be limited. Altogether, activities must be restricted to be fair, as Martha has described, that if you're going to limit the use of worship in one area, such as industrial land, you may have to limit the services that support that. A motion was made after we had voted to exclude industrial services. A motion was made to include a place of worship in industrial zones. No second motion was made. So this passed without including industrial zones in 287. Any questions?
Thank you, Gerald Murphy. In a moment, I'll have County Council opine if you think you need to. Martha Fritzie, the questions that Mr. Murphy raised today, did he raise those during your Planning Commission processes?
Yes,
Okay, and they were answered.
there was a lot of discussion about them, yes.
Okay, were they answered to staff satisfaction?
Yes,
Do
I
you
think
want to
so.
opine further on that today?
No.
Okay. Jeff Mums, do you have anything you'd like to say?
I think Chair Murphy had discussed, defining place of worship, and I don't think that we need to do so in our zoning code. There's plenty of federal law on that question, as well as state law, that helps us define what a place of worship would be. If we had a question that came up, it does not need to be defined separately in our zoning ordinance.
Okay. Thank you, Gerald Murphy. You used the word across the country as your own anecdotal research. I don't know if you mean America or across Oregon, but as we know, Oregon's land use laws are very, very specific, sometimes onerous, and really don't match up with the rest of the country of America. So I just want to make that point clear if anybody is listening out there. Commissioners?
Yes, Sir Smith, I did, my search was from coast to coast, across our country.
Yeah, so, and as you know, Mr. Murphy, the Oregon land use laws are very different than what's allowed in other states regarding, I assume, places of worship and uses in industrial zones. And in Clackamas County, look, we don't have a lot of industrial lands. And if this board or staff wants to revisit uses of industrial lands in Clackamas County, I think this board will probably be open to that discussion at a later date, but not today. Thank you very much. I will now open the public hearing for testimony on this item, beginning with the public officials. Are there any public officials who wish to testify?
Chair Smith, we don't have anyone online.
Thank you very much. Are there any representatives from any CPOs or agencies that wish to testify? You will have 3 minutes.
Chair Smith, we also don't have anyone online for CPOs or agencies.
We will now hear testimony from members of the public. I will call the names of people who have indicated an intent to testify who are in person. I see no one in the room who wishes to testify, and there are no blue cards in the basket. Everett, do we have anyone on Zoom from the public who wishes to testify?
Chair Smith, we don't have anyone on Zoom at this time.
Thank you. Well, that's the end of my list. I will now close the public testimony portion of this hearing. Do commissioners have any questions or comments at this time? Commissioner Scholl.
Chair, I just, before you call a vote on this, I would just like to hear the amendment spoken verbally. Just tell us what it is verbally.
You mean the motion?
No, the amendments to the ZDO. Okay, I've got a page here from your June 26 hearing. Okay.
So the amendments that are proposed today include text amendments to 9 different sections of our zoning and development ordinance. And it would amend all of our residential zones, urban and rural, to allow for places of worship as a primary use instead of a conditional use. It would amend, I think, 8 of the 15 commercial zones, urban and rural, to allow places of worship as a primary use instead of a conditional use. It would amend the open space management district to allow places of worship as a conditional use. And it would amend the section 1015, which is parking, and 804, which is specific standards for places of worship.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? I will entertain a motion.
I move we approve ZDO 287 as recommended by the Planning Commission and staff.
Second.
Commissioner Scholl has moved, we approve ZDO-287 as recommended by the Planning Commission and staff. Any further comments on, excuse me, Commissioner Savas has seconded the motion. Any further comments on this?
Chair, I just
Yes.
want to just say that over the 12 years of being here, I've heard right out of the gate of concerns about places of worship in certain areas, including residential, and where they should be or where they shouldn't be, and farmland should be or not be, and concerns that conflict with so many. I just find it fascinating that there's no one here to speak to this today. After all these years of, some emotional testimony or concerns or airings of how it should be one way or another. So I am perfectly fine with the staff's work and proposal and the Planning Commission's work, and thank everyone for their efforts.
Commissioner Savas, I would tend to agree with you. I am too really remarkably surprised that no one is commenting on this today. But such as it is, it's been noticed. We've been working on this for many, many, many months. I want to thank staff, especially County Council, for getting us to a point that's acceptable. I appreciate the organization that brought this forward to make us look at this through a very different lens than maybe what we had considered before. That's important. Basically, we've listened to our constituency on this, and we'll continue to do so as issues arise. And sometimes government moves slower than some of these people would like, but hey, we're getting it across the finish line. And I do appreciate that from staff. Thank you for listening and doing very good work on this. Seeing no further comments, I will call for the vote.
Commissioner Savas.
Aye.
Commissioner Scholl.
Aye.
Chair Smith.
Aye, motion passes 3-0. Now that the proposal has been approved, I will direct staff to draft an ordinance reflecting this decision and include it on the agenda for this board's adoption at the board's August 3rd business meeting. Anything else? For consideration, comments? Hearing none?
Chair, I'd like to say one comment. I just thank the Planning Commission and the motion this morning, because this decision is less restrictive government. And I think that's very important. Thank you.
Yep, you bet, it is. Thank you very much. Seeing no further business before this commission, we are adjourned.